The title for the sermon is Hurtful Words That You Cannot Control. Hurtful words that you cannot control. Psalm 64. From the secret counsel of evildoers, from the tumult of those who do iniquity, who have sharpened their tongue like a sword. They aimed bitter speech as their arrow to shoot from concealment at the blameless. Suddenly they shoot at him and do not fear. They hold fast to themselves an evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly. They say, who can see them? They devise injustices, saying, we are ready with a well-conceived plot. For the inward thought in the heart of a man are deep. But God will shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly they will be wounded. So they will shake the head. Then all men will fear, and they will declare the work of God, and will consider what he has done. The righteous man will be glad in the Lord and will take refuge in him, and all the upright in heart will glory. The childhood epigram that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is actually very ill advised. Words hurt. Words do things. We live in a universe where words have authority to, when they're used destructively, to destroy, and when they're used edifyingly, to edify. Words are not just sounds in the air. Of all people, Christians, us, who worship the eternal word that became flesh, ought to be people who know this, people who are concerned about words. We believe in the potency of words. For we believe that the cosmos was created by the Logos, which is another word for the Word that John mentions in John chapter 1. You see it in Genesis 1. God forms the world by the Word, and he preserves the world by the Word. Hebrews 1, he upholds all things by the word of his power. And the final day of judgment, 2 Peter 2, says the present heavens and earth are being reserved still by the word. We believe that the gospel, which is a word, it is a good word, is the power of God unto salvation. It's foolishness to those who believe, but to the called, it is the power of God. Consequently, one of the things we have to learn to do as Christians is to guard our tongues. And we are reminded of that not only in the book of James, but in a psalm like this, in Psalm 64. As we see in verse 3, words are compared to swords and to arrows. This, therefore, necessarily shows up in the raising of children. For who would put an arrow or a sword into the hands of children? I have a memory of being left at home, and my dad had a bow and arrow, and us children got it out, and we target practiced on the couch with the arrow. Several arrows. Parents come home, and like Robin Hood, there's this arrows stuck in the couch. We couldn't pull them out. We were caught. We thought, like, as though you're going to pull it out and not be caught. But surely you would not give, you think of giving a weapon to a child. I remember there was this old man who was a World War II vet, And he lived a little ways down the road from us growing up, and he had all this woods behind his house property, and he let us squirrel hunt there. His name was Rex Boyette. And I remember when my dad first bought me my first pump shotgun. And boy, I was going to shoot some squirrels with this thing. And so he took me over to Brother Rex's house, and we get out, and I go to show him my new shotgun. I'm so excited. And I'll never forget this lesson. He immediately handed the gun back to me. He said, "Son, the safety is off on this gun." And to this day, every time I look at the safety on a gun, I think of Rex. If you're walking in a line, going through the woods, you need to point down or up. You don't point it out. And when you shoot, you have this kind of range, if you're in a duck line and so forth. So what a thing. We would not, the point is, we would not put a gun or an arrow into the hands of a small child, and yet words are these things, and God has ordained for children to have the ability to use them at a very young age. So there's a kind of weapon that children have access to, and that's why I said this shows up of necessity in parenting. Children, therefore, just like adults, show to be prone to wonder, to begin accusing, to begin lying, to begin misrepresenting, to begin not confessing what is true at a very young age. Sin has taught our children where the trigger is. Parents must teach them where the safety is and where to point it and when to shoot and not shoot. So then, just by way of introduction, the thought is that words are potent, and therefore Christians, as well as trying with their children, are those that are trying to control their mouths. But that's not what Psalm 64 is about. That's not the question. The question of this psalm is, what do you do, not when you don't control yours, not when you don't control your mouth, but when you live with and have to have dealings with those who do not control theirs? How do you wade through that? How do you listen to that? How do you respond to that? What do you do with uncontrollable, harmful speech from others that you cannot stop? That's what this psalm is about. So if every psalm is sort of like a life question about something, some piece of wisdom, how do you do this? How do you do that? Almost as though you were sitting with some old wise person and you just want to ask them everything, right? Well, what do you do in this case? And what do you do when this happens? Well, the Psalms are like that. And this one is, what do you do with hurtful words that you cannot control? If you haven't experienced this yet as a Christian, just wait. You will. So let's see what David says. Starting with verse 1, actually, we'll divide it into two chunks. In verse 1 all the way to verse 6, what we see are the uncontrollable, harmful words of men. Line 1 in verse 1, David says, "Hear my voice, O God, in my complaint." The first thing you notice about this situation is only God can handle it. When it gets to this point, you must bring the case to God. You must pray to God. That's the first thing. Sometimes we just keep talking, but there is this injunction here to, when you're in this situation, pray and bring the case to God. Line 2 of verse 1, he asked God David asked God to preserve his life. He says, preserve my life. This is not a metaphor. False charges, as you know, can lead to death. False charges in the case of Joseph ruined his life for decades. So false charges against another human being hurt. In one word, if you want to sum up false charges, they hurt. They hurt people in varying degrees up and down the ladder. And so David knows this, and so he's praying for the Lord to preserve his life from this hurt. Now, David reckons these people to be his enemies, for he says, preserve my life from the dread of the enemy. And this is interesting. Certainly someone who is hurting you in a destructive way is not your friend. So if you want to know who are your friends and who are your enemies, just ask yourself this: who is it that hurts you in a constructive way versus who is it that hurts you in a destructive way? Notice it's not who is it that hurts you and who is it that doesn't hurt you, but it's who is it that hurts you like a surgeon and who is it that hurts you like a thug. Proverbs 26 verse 7 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Proverbs 12:10, even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. The way the wicked and a wicked mind and the pattern of wickedness would say that it is having compassion is actually hurtful. And to someone who has no concern to be holy and to grow in holiness, Hebrews 12, it seems not joyful, but it yields the fruit of righteousness, has no category for hurt at all. Now, the reason this feels very strange to us, I was thinking about this, is we grew up on a very, what would you call it, un-psalm-like hymnals of music. Very un-psalm-like hymnals of music. Very few modern hymns have any enemies in them. Very few songs on K-Love present a Christian with enemies against them. You think about it, very few songs that you grew up singing have that. Now, there are some. A mighty fortress is our God. But that's a very psalm-like hymn for that reason. So one thing you notice then by studying the Psalms, by this point, I think, is that the psalmist had enemies. Now, the reason the modern church can get away with this is because most Christians are not even on the field. So who cares if it smells like a Motel 6? We had to stay in this hotel, and it was horrific. The smell. And I gave Charlie a good statement about the choice that she made, because we had to put up with this, smell this, and Miss Rhonda would not have stayed. And she's confirming it with a head shake. It was terrible. But you might get through it, right? With the sense that, well, we're just going to be here. And this is what most Christians in the West today, thankfully, is being a swing back. But thinking, well, this world is not our home. G.K. Chesterton has a chapter in his book, Orthodoxy, I'll never forget, called The Flag of This World. And there is a sense in which you put the Christian flag in the world. This is God's world. This is not the white witches' territory. This is Aslan's territory. It belongs to God. And when you take the field, when you have that view, of the Christian life, that it's not just supposed to occur in here. It's not just defensive. We don't just huddle in here and pray that the beast of the government would leave us alone. But when we go on the offensive and we go to take ground, then you will experience drawing enemy fire. And David was clearly a man who had done so, and so he had enemies. And so he prays for the Lord to save them from, notice, the dread of the enemy. The dread of the enemy. So David reasons, well, if I have to have them, I can't escape them, but at least I can escape the dread of them. So I have to have them, but I don't have to fear them. And so we go on. He goes on. He says what makes these guys that he's up against so vexing, so consternating, is that they fight like Hamas. They fight like Hamas. He says, hide me from the secret counsel of evildoers. So they hide. It's guerrilla warfare. He wants to deal with the situation, but because there's pockets of secrecy, it's just something that is almost out of your control. So they talk in secret councils, and he uses the word tumult, energy, this electricity that develops. And so the church, I would say today, is very good at noticing the danger of mob justice. But, you saw it in the Derek Chauvin and the George Floyd and the riots around 2020. And there's this, we know it, right, from the mobs who want to crucify Jesus. So mob justice is about the furthest thing that should ever be held dear and entertained and coddled and fluffed and petted by a Christian. But I'm afraid that we've made a categorical error where we've defined only large mobs as mob justice. But we don't have as much fear of small mobs. So you have large mobs and you have small mobs, mobettes, let's call them. You have mobs and mobettes, and they are both unable to dispense justice. To dispense, if there's one thing I've learned so far, and it's the mark of an elder, it's one of the qualifications at least. Paul tells Titus he must be just. He must be fair. That means we all have friends, we all have little tribes, and John Adams is an example of this. In the Boston Massacre, he defended the British soldiers, which was just incredibly a scandal to the colonists at the time. But he knew what Benjamin Franklin knew, which is why Benjamin Franklin is not a president, but he wasn't one, but he's on the $100 bill. Do you know why? Because he uttered the quote that it is better for 100 guilty men to go free than for one innocent man to be condemned. It is better for 100 guilty men to go free than for one innocent man to be condemned. It's very, very difficult. Gandalf tells Frodo, do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, Frodo. He says there are men who lived who deserve death and men who died that deserved life. Are you able to give it to them? So we don't know how big this is. Is it a mob, a mobette? But it's one of these. And now in line 5 and 6, I mean, that's the vexing thing about them. But in line 5 and 6, what David says is they not only fight like Hamas, let's say, look at verse 3, not only do they fight like Hamas in secret council, but they sharpen the sword and they aim bitter speech as an arrow. So they sharpen their tongues, their tongue swords in these meetings. They talk Let's get the point sharp that we're going to make. And they dip this into bitterness, like that sword that killed Hamlet. The speech becomes so infected with bitterness that just to touch the sword is poison. And then in lines 7 and 8, he says, which is in verse 4, I'm going by the lines, but verse 4, for line 7 and 8, he says, when they are finally ready, they strike. They shoot from concealment, like a hunter, the way you hunt, waiting and waiting and waiting, and then out of nowhere comes the attack. Out of nowhere comes the bullet. Out of nowhere, at least from the perception of the deer or the duck or the turkey or the bird or the dove or the squirrel, whatever it is, out of nowhere there comes the attack. He says, notice the words suddenly. Suddenly they shoot at him, and they do not fear. So suddenly they shoot at him, and they do not fear. Now, when this sort of thing happens, this psalm is written, the righteous are supposed to be able to read the room. The Bible is written not just that we will stare at the Bible all the time. We need to know the Word. So you need to know the book of Romans. You need to know Corinthians. But you read the Word in order to be able to read the world, right? If all you do is read the Word and you can't translate it into how to live, then that's pretty useless. And if all you're doing is in the world, but you're not bringing the Word to it, that's also pretty useless. So we need to know Romans in what it means, but we also need to know how to handle Ritz crackers and eyeliner and football games and math and mayonnaise, all of it, So the gospel is not about everything is not the gospel, Van Til says, but the gospel has something to say to everything. So that whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God. So we're supposed to be able to read the room. We're supposed, Hebrews says the righteous are supposed to have their senses trained to discern good and evil. That means growing in knowledge of God and discernment to the point to where you can see a situation and you can notice a pattern. Okay, you can notice a pattern. It doesn't mean you can bring an accusation yet, right? So, but it means you can notice a pattern. Now, what kind of pattern? That even though this attack came out of nowhere, it really didn't. It really didn't. Notice who it is aimed at in verse 4. To shoot from concealment at the blameless. At the blameless. John asks us in 1 John, for what reason did Cain kill Abel? Because his deeds were righteous. You remember Jesus pointed out something similar. For what reason did they hate him and not believe him? Because he told them the truth. So whenever you see a righteous man, some Christian trying to stand, in the way, trying to promote godliness, trying to take a stand where there needs to be a stand, trying to do something holy, and you suddenly see that man or that woman attacked, you're supposed to be able to read the room. That didn't come from nowhere. You may not know who was running a play, but you're to say somebody was running a play. Somebody is running a play. This did not come out of nowhere. Suddenly it became public, but it didn't suddenly get to this point. Bitter, secret speech is better compared to a plant than a bomb. A bomb just suddenly goes off in the atomic bomb, right? Oppenheimer. But a plant is more like this thing that develops and develops and develops. And then you wake up one morning and boom, there's Oprah coming out. And that's how bitter secret speech is. It develops and develops and develops, David says, and suddenly it's released. So this means when we see these patterns, we don't know. You're not allowed yet to make a false accusation, right? You don't want to repeat the error. But you are allowed to say these things do not just happen. So, saying that after saying suddenly he was attacked in this way, verse 5, amazing, when sinning will make you tired. Sinning, wicked people get wore out. It's very, very hard to live a life that is just full of, these kind of conversations and this kind of work. In Rome, even, the lions got tired of eating Christians. And it was like they threw the Christians in there and the lions didn't even eat them. They had more mercy than men. And so sometimes it's hard for the wicked to do this. And it's hard on their conscience. Their conscience is constantly convicting them. That's why you have a pride parade, Not because, why do you have that? Because it's very, very hard to suppress the conscience about this issue. And so what you need is other people to get around you and help put more weight and help suppress that truth and feel better about that and push it down. That's what's happening there. And so what they do is they encourage each other. He says, verse 5, they hold fast, or it says they make firm, or another translation, they encourage themselves in the evil purpose. So they call each other and say, hey, just keep the flame going, right? For lack of wood, the fire goes out. So you have to keep the thing going. And so they hold fast. These people David is up against, they hold fast to themselves in evil purpose. And they talk to one another about this to keep it up. Finally, line 11 and 12 in verse 6. He says, they devise injustices. Other translations, they search out injustices. They go on a dirt mud hunt like it's a treasure hunt. They are looking for something to stick. So in these secret councils, they go out from them and they make searches. And, eventually they find something. So they devise these injustices, and when they get them, they think this one will work. We are ready, it says, with a well-conceived plot. Other translations, we are complete, so this will work. And they are able to do this. He adds, when he says for, this is why they're able to do this. He says they're able to do this because the inward thought and heart of a man are deep, unsearchable. So this is amazing. Paul says the mercy and the kindness and so forth of God, his wisdom is unsearchable. Who can know that? And Jeremiah says, yes, in the heart of a sinner, a heart of a fallen man is, who can know it? Who can know the depths of it, of where bitterness will go? It was Bunyan or Owen one who said, all men know the beginning of sin, but no man knows the end of sin. Paul calls it inventors of iniquity. G.K. Chesterton put it this way. He said, evil will always take advantage of ambiguity. What does that mean? It means if your heart is against someone and they make a statement, and the statement could mean either A or B, if meaning A would mean they sinned against you, you are more prone to conclude meaning A. So evil takes advantage of ambiguity. The other way we've said it is it's like a dartboard. When a relationship is not right, you feel like you have to hit the bullseye with this person every single time. Your accent must be right. Your commas must be right. Your periods must be right. Everything must be right. But when a relationship is right, you can entirely miss a dartboard, and they will go pick up your arrows for you, your darts for you, and bring them back. The vast majority of relational issues on earth that have ever occurred are a matter of the heart. The heart. If the heart is right, there's grace, there's generous ears, there's generous eyes. If the heart is not right, there's suspecting ears and suspecting eyes, and everything gets out of hand from there. And so he says, verse 6, the inward thought in the heart of man are deep. And you've seen this with your wife, she thought something or you thought something, and they almost, it's comical. It's like, no, I didn't mean that. And no, the point is the imagination, the wounded, hurt imagination of man is deep. That's what he's saying. So, but the good news is, verse 7 to 10, the good news is God is not absent from this equation. And so this is where this psalm becomes so helpful to handle these kinds of situations. So in verses 7 to 10, what we see in contrast to the uncontrollable, hurtful words of men, we see the controllable, helpful works of God. We get one of those famous but God statements in verse 7. We have these throughout the Bible, just as there's a but God in Ephesians 2:4. We were dead, we were demonic, we were doomed, but God, being rich in mercy, made us alive while we were weak, while we were towards us. We have one in 1 Corinthians 1:27. You might be weak in this world, you might be one of the are nots, but God has chosen those to reverse everything. There's a reversal. And so even depression, 2 Corinthians 7:6, Paul says he was despairing and so forth, but God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus. So God, amazing there, right? Ministered to Paul through Titus, and you've experienced that as a Christian. But here is another one of those but gods. And so he begins to comfort himself here and say, they are hiding, but God sees them. So notice verse 2, he asks to hide me. There's a poetic justice here. They are hiding from me, making plans, so hide me from them. Be my hideaway, like we just sang. So God sees, they might be swelling something, a tumult might be growing, but God is in control of that tumult. It is not the case that God controls everything and there is this growing fire out of his control. He controls every lick and turn of that flame. He begins to encourage himself in that. They are uncontrollable, but God is in control. God is able to control himself and overlook his whole creation And their words are harmful, but God's words are helpful. They have words, but God has works. So note the poetic justice. God will shoot at them with an arrow. They have shot with an arrow. God will shoot with an arrow. Suddenly they attacked the saints. Suddenly God will attack them. This is like in Cinderella when the fairy godmother says, "For you shall go to the ball." Why? Because the evil stepmother said, "You shall not go to the ball." And why do people like those shows? Why do people like Sleeping Beauty, where there's these arrows and the little fairies, they turn them into little flowers falling down? There's this idea that there must be something divine, there must be something to intervene and save man from the evil influences of other men, and of course the devil and so forth. So they have shot at them. Suddenly they have wounded and hurt. Suddenly they will be wounded. The next verse, verse 8, continues this theme, this ironic theme of poetic justice. He says, "So they will make him stumble. Their own tongue is against them." Their own tongue is against them. Remember Joseph's brothers. "We will see what will come. Let us throw him in this pit. Let us sell him, as a slave. And then we will see what comes of these dreams." Well, because God controls everything and always establishes purpose, that means when someone is against God, like Gamaliel said, remember, "For then you will be fighting against God." How could you fight against God? This is the devil's error. In his first fall, he used power. And then in his second fall, you might say, he thought, well, let me try craft. Maybe he's like Scar. Like, I can't defeat Mufasa with power, but brains. And so then he discovers the message of Job, that God catches the wise in their own craftiness. Thomas Boston says, the cross, the wood on the cross, was a mousetrap by which God caught Satan. And he sprung the trap. And so this is what we're dealing with. It's not like some weapons will, no, he says, no weapon formed against you will prosper. You see, you don't have to worry. You don't have to fret. That's the point. And so poetic justice is therefore the work of God. Look at verse 9. "Then all men will fear, and they will declare the work of God and consider what he has done." There is no impersonal law called karma. There is a personal God of providence who cares about his creation, cares about all the animals, the crickets, the people, all the angels. He cares about his creation, and therefore he is not okay if we mistreat one another. And so he says, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay." Acts 28:4. There are these natives on the island, and Paul he escapes the ship, and the snake, the viper, fastens to his hand. And what did they say? "Surely this man is a murderer, and justice has caught up with him." The book of Judges opens with Israel going to take the land, and there is this king in Judges 1:6-7 who used to have 70 kings that he had conquered sit around his table with their thumbs cut off and their big toe cut off so that they could not escape. and they had to be his slaves and be humiliated. And when Israel catches him, when he flees, they cut off his thumbs and cut off his big toes. And what did his inner conscience say to him? God has repaid me. He knew. Men know that God exists, and they fear his justice. And there's only one place to go for fear of his justice, and that is to the cross. This happens later to Abimelech in Judges 9. Same thing. It uses this verbiage, God has brought down upon the head of Abimelech what he did. In Matthew 23:35, Jesus says, upon this generation will come all the blood since righteous Abel. In Genesis 15:16, God tells Abraham, your people cannot go into the promised land yet because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, because the execution against a crime is not exercised speedily, men's hearts are encouraged to do it. But Johnny Cash wrote a song about this. You can run on for a long time. You can throw your rock and hide your hand, working in the dark against your fellow man, but as sure as God made black and white, what's done in the dark will be brought to the light. You can run on for a long time, but sooner or later, he's going to cut you down. Annabelle and I used to rock that song driving in the truck. That's the message you see here, that there is justice in this universe. Numbers 32:23. Be certain of this one thing, that your sin will find you out. God, who runs the universe, who knows all things, intends to bring every work to light. There's no escaping it. What can you do? Heaven and earth might flee, right? Though you descend, the prophet says, into Hades, or you ascend into the heavens, from there I will bring you down, and from there I will pull you up and judge you. There is no escape. It's like Katniss on the Hunger Games, moving, trying to escape from the great white throne. There is no escape. And so you can fall off on two sides of this doctrine, and here I want to include something. It's very, very important. Because when you hear this vengeance, you think, yes, right? God is going to get my enemies. Well, there are two wrong views here. On the one side, you have this super pro-vengeance attitude where vengeance belongs to us, and you make sin personal. It's just like two children in the nursery, and one of them clocks the other one in the head, and there's just a natural fleshly response to clock back, right? You hit me, I'm going to hit you. And that is the flesh, okay? And Jesus flat out forbids that for the Christian. You have heard it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. However, we are to, because Paul tells us to overcome evil with good, not just stare at it silently, to overcome evil with good. So we are not to react in the flesh, but we are to respond in the spirit. And that's what David does here. He doesn't, so both are fleshly. You need to see both are fleshly. To just simply tit for tat, and you scratch me and I scratch you and I'm just angry because what? That is the flesh. But passive indifference is also the flesh. Paul tells Timothy, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's not, well, just don't go along as it. You must reject it. It is to be rejected. There's only two movements there: accept it or reject it, or really the third, go through the process to discover it. But to not respond, the Christian is always called to respond to evil and to overcome evil. And that is what David is doing here. So when we find ourselves in a situation, even if we are sinned against, we are not to be reacting out of just that kind of a battle. We're to be reacting to, God has ordained this. Yes, my conscience recognizes certain things, but I'm called in this situation to triumph over this evil and to gain control over this evil. As God looked out over the chaos, I mean, what a vision in Genesis. There's formless and void and darkness, and the Spirit of God is hovering. I mean, God cast his vision on this chaos, and he begins to speak his word and form something which is good and very good. And we are made in his image, and we are to go into every situation. If you're a mom and there's chaos in your home, you're to cast your vision on that and begin to speak the word of God until you get control of this in such a way that it is good. We have that ability as Christians. We have the word, which it says is above all earthly powers. We have the gate that cannot be prevailed against. So we are to engage and do this, and that is what David is doing here. And in this case, what he must do is respond by prayer to God, and that's what he does. And so we end with verse 10. We end with verse 10, verses 9 and 10. All who see what happens here will shake the head. God has chosen the foolish to shame the wise. Okay? So God intends to shame certain men when they do not fear by making false accusations. It will either happen in this life. There's like this view, that's just full of personal antipathy. But there's this other view that there is no vengeance. And everyone is saved in the end, and we all get to the great white throne judgment and have one big group hug. And that's how this goes and ends. But that's not, people repay, says the Lord. Every word will be brought into judgment. When Harry and Marv fall into the same pit with fear, and they will declare the work of God, and they will consider what he has done. They will consider what he's done, and this is the point. They will realize that if the universe is under the control of God in this way, and if vengeance belongs to him, and he will repay, as Johnny Cash said, sooner or later, then what do I have to worry about? I just wait on the Lord. I'll bring the matter to the Lord, and I'll wait on the Lord. If I can't control the speech, I'll bring the matter to the Lord, and I'll wait for that. So, in conclusion, this psalm teaches us that we are to learn how to read stories. We're to learn how to read stories. Lewis wrote the Narnia series, and laden through there, you'll find like, well, how do you know if we should follow the robin? And it says, robins I know from the stories I read were good, and so we'll follow the robin. And Landry says, look, when all this happened, I didn't believe in magic, but now that I see it true, in all the stories I read, people like you don't turn out well. So I think you're going to get what's coming to you. And he does. And what Lewis is doing is he's trying to help children. Everything's not precept. Sometimes it's narrative, it's story, that there are patterns in the world. And getting wisdom is seeing the pattern. So, you read Genesis 12 and you think, this, Abraham went down to Egypt and Pharaoh is there trying to reign over him in some way, and God sends plagues and he's released. You're like, well, that happened in Exodus to Moses. Yeah, it also happened to Abraham. That there's this righteous sufferer theme, and the Lord vindicates him. There's this Job theme, and the Lord vindicates him, who Jesus brings to fruition, right? He is the one. If you think of those passion plays, and there he is, and the tears falling down his face, and I've been in situations like that, and seen others in situations like that, where there's nothing you can do but trust God with this situation, and God did vindicate him. God did vindicate him. Lost people know this. Jennifer Lee, the director, one of the directors of Frozen franchise, tells the story when she was a little girl, and a Christian today. Say you're a child and you're not even a Christian. Why do you think you watch Disney movies? Why do you think you look at your iPad? Because you know this. It's ingrained in you that you need to read the stories, and the stories are somehow teaching you about life if they're good ones. And so what Jennifer Lee would do is she would come home every day after school, and this woman played Cinderella while she did her homework every single day after school. And she would just be telling herself, don't believe the bullies, don't give in. What was she doing there? That she was trying to read the stories. She was trying to learn the patterns of hope. And so what we're to see is poetic justice is not impersonal. Poetic justice is God's providence. And therefore, the righteous have nothing to fear of the schemes of anyone against them, but the wicked who are doing scheming have plenty to fear. This is Psalm 64. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God for it. Amen.